Religion was often held by a lot of liberal moderns as a vessel of peace. Especially in Protestant contexts, they would say it's a peace that is inner, private. But some others would say it provides social peace. Given an uneven trend over the centuries toward cultural pluralism and what looked like freedom to some people, modern theorists optimistically concluded that religion would either decline in significance or become a pillar of what they thought of as universalistic culture promoting a form of humanism. So as a flashpoint of violence from the past, perhaps, religion today did not warrant attention in the overall narrative of the modern world. And yet, such a reading of historical development is far too optimistic, as the events of September the 11th that we have been commemorating all too vividly demonstrate. Since 9/11/2001, the questions began to alter. They started to say, how do we understand religion's violent currents? A moment's reflection attests that religion and violence are often woven together in history's tapestries. Any number of religions, not simply one particular religion, have justified violence under certain circumstances, and others have become caught up in its processes. In the ancient world, Zoroastrianism transformed earlier combat myths into a theology of eternal apocalyptic struggle between good and evil. Ancient Judaism forged a community relating to conditions of war. Early Christianity had its martyrs, and the medieval Roman Church its crusades and Inquisition. As for Islam, the close association between political society and religious identity in the formative period of its history, together with the principle of jihad, which among the classical theorists justified offensive war for the sake of the spreading of the religion, has made some contemporary Islamist groups to infuse politics with enduring potential for violence. Even Buddhism, thought to be a foundation for a peaceful philosophy, had some monks seeking nirvana through methods of violence. Similarly, the Hindu nativist zealots of the Tamil Tigers initiated a tradition of suicide killing too. But despite all of this, human conflicts are very varied. And despite some efforts to track them down to religious faith, it doesn't always work like that. So it's important to remember that the picture is always complicated. The fact that faith is a marker of identity is, of course, just a sociological observation. When people's identity is under threat, they may well turn to faith as a vastly important marker and resourceful identity model, which can be brandished against others. But if religious faiths were always the sources of conflict, you might expect to see conflict in places where, in fact, you don't. The fact that there are faith-related conflicts in so many places does suggest that religious faith remains a strong identity marker, and a very dangerous one at that. So, should we have no religion then? The example of the last century tells us the opposite. It reminds us that reconciliation, or the solution to our problems, if you like, doesn't get to the bottom of the problem by negating religion. We can't solve it like that. Reconciliation can't happen when we relegate faith to the private sphere. At the end of the day, bad religion is driven out by good, rather than by no religion. The energy to combat religious extremism is more likely to come from within a religious tradition. And here is something for us to think about as Christians. Dorothy Sayers, when she was writing her radio plays, The Man Born to be King, back in the 1950s, She comments in her introductory essays to those plays that while she was writing them and while they were being broadcast, she had a lot of rather abusive correspondence from good Christians who thought that the whole enterprise was deeply mistaken. You couldn't have anybody speaking the words of Jesus on the radio, they thought. And then she adds, and I quote here, she said, "Why don't Christians realize that they have done the unforgivable? They have taken the story of the incarnation of God and they have made it boring. If I tell you that the infinite, unchangeable creator of all things has led a human life, in the course of which he was flogged and spat on and nailed up like a scarecrow, call it what you like, but don't say it's boring. It takes a lot of work to make that dull." So after all, despite the inadequacy of our talking, despite our many failures, despite the failure of the world and its miseries and anxieties in East and West, it's good to remember that we have a story to share. There has been a word spoken to us, a word that is not dull at all, a word that is not simply on a page, a word that is a living human being, that opens and surprises us to who God is and what God does, and shows once and for all the difference between what we think God is and who God really is. This story tells us that the atmosphere of conflict and hostility does not have to be the natural position for human beings. It can be changed if we are courageous enough to face that story of the man born to be king and his unconditional openness to us and welcome for us. Then everything begins to look like a promise. The control of violence through policies is something that is, you might say, a good start. But will it make a difference at the end of the day? What will make a difference is the dealing with our own fears, the pressures of releasing our own anxieties at the expense of others. What we need is what you might call a new heart and a new spirit, as the Bible says, when peace on earth doesn't have to be an empty hope. So whenever you hear people say faith has no place in the public sphere, we should ask them to think again.